Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome to this presentation. My name is Danielle Kanstroom, and as the Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy here at Boston College Law School, and on behalf of our Executive Director, Lissy Medvedow, who is there, and our Administrative Assistant, Abi Chingo, who is there, it's my great pleasure to, well, you're all leaving. This reminds me of my career as a musician. As soon as I start playing, they start migrating out. All right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop talking for about 3 minutes and let people get settled, because this is, my self-esteem is not sufficient.
They just put up photos.
I know they put up the photo. I was going to suggest that people wait for
Take a minute to do a photo while we're...
Yeah, let's do it.
Is that all right?
You want to sit in here?
I think standing.
Say hello to our distinguished panelists.
Hi, welcome.
Okay.
It's great to see you. So good to see you. I'm so glad you're here. We were talking about you all night. I was like, she saw me. Oh, like, like your ears were burning. You're like, how are you? Good, good. Hey, guys. Well, boss. Because I used to work at Clear, you know. I kept talking about her. Like, who is this person? I love her so much.
I'm Danielle.
Nice to meet you. She knows.
She
heard all about you.
Oh, yes. Yes. Her amazing thing. So good to put it.
Thank you. I don't want to get in the way of your picture. So excited to hear what you have to say today. Yeah. Over here? Yeah. I need to go sense of place again. Let's just be right side. Yep, perfect. Lovely. Two on each side. Yeah, that's great. So if we just try, actually, yeah, let's bring it in. It's better. Yeah, we have some. We know what the sign looks like. More. Thank you. I have these nice.
Okay, let's start again. Welcome, students, faculty, colleagues, ravenous hordes, whoever you are. Welcome to you all to this Rappaport Center event. I'm Dan Kanstroom. I'm the Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center here at Boston College Law School, and you are here for an important panel presentation entitled Municipalities and Migrants, Balancing Compassion and Challenges. The famous inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty reads, "Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." But as any student of immigration history knows, this was always, at most, an aspiration. Never a true description of the incredibly complex, often poignant, painful, and yes, racist history of U.S. immigration law and policy. Today, once again, this ideal is being profoundly tested, not only at the national level, but particularly for state and local governments. Some say we're in the midst of a unique crisis of undocumented migration, albeit perhaps a product of long-standing geopolitical forces, a global pandemic, climate change, and so on, that calls for extensive creative new thinking. But many others say the solutions are simple. Build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Or on the other side, simply recognize that the U.S. has always been a nation of immigrants, and it's always worked out over time, and worked well despite episodic reactionary politics. Just handle it. One can hardly imagine a more timely and complex set of issues for our center. In one sense, these complexities are eternal, and the questions are eternal. Is the U.S. now, and has it ever been, really a nation of immigrants? Or is it a settler colonialist nation? Does it have a robust commitment to social dynamism, to cultural pluralism, to protection of refugees, to racial and ethnic diversity, and to human rights for all people, regardless of their technical legal status or their ethnicity or their language or their religion or their race? Or have the limits of such a model been reached, and particularly have they recently been reached? Many current polls do suggest such limits. I don't know if people saw the exit polling out of New Hampshire. It was quite striking in terms of how high that was ranked among voters as one of the issues they cared the most about. And political actors ranging from Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and Texas Governor Greg Abbott have seized on this, of course. But we also now hear new and poignant concerns about stretched budgets and major political challenges from Democratic politicians, such as Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, who recently said that the current so-called migrant crisis could, quote, destroy the city of New York, end quote. Or from Denver Mayor Mike Johnston, who has undertaken some powerful and what I would call positive steps. But he said on CNN that housing migrants in Denver was going to consume at least 10% of Denver's total budget, an unsustainable amount. So what is to be done? Well, here we are, and I will say that as one who has toiled in these arenas of immigration law and human rights for some decades now, I'm especially looking forward to hearing from the stellar speakers we have assembled today. We've brought together folks who have not only thought about these issues in great detail, but also who have been actively involved in policy implementation in compassionate, creative, pragmatic, fact-based, granular ways. So let me introduce them to you now and we'll get right into it. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes or so, plus or minus, and then we'll have some follow-up discussion with some questions that I will pose, and then I very much hope, and in fact I can guarantee, that we'll have plenty of time for questions that you may pose. So I'm hoping that we have a robust discussion about these issues from a variety of perspectives. I do have a couple of things that I want to mention just before I introduce the speakers. First, this is the first program of the Rappaport Center for this semester. We're going to have others, and some of them are going to be really great. In fact, all of them are going to be really great. The food may not be quite as good at all of them, and in some places it may be better. Our next program is going to be really great. That's on February 7th at 11:45, and it's entitled The People's Lawyer, The Impact of State Attorneys General. Bear in mind, the plural of Attorney General is Attorneys General. The plural of District Attorney, District Attorneys. This is one of the enduring mysteries of my life. It features our current Attorney General, Andrea Joy Campbell, also Charity Clark, who's the Attorney General from Vermont, a graduate of, yes, Boston College, and Peter Nerona, AG from Rhode Island, a graduate of, yes, Boston College. And we're also excited to report that Kimberly Atkins Storr, fantastic Boston Globe columnist, will be joining us as our Rappaport Senior Fellow in February. And she's going to give a public lecture on February 19th entitled, quote, Where the Biometric Buck Stops, Accountability for Facial Recognition Bias, which is really an important subject. And that'll be followed by a panel event on February 21st on the same topic of facial recognition technology, exploring privacy, profiling, and public safety. So stay tuned, check our website early and often. Finally, I want to tell you, this program is being streamed on Zoom, and it's going to be recorded. And if you are on Zoom watching and you want to pose questions, you may do that. But please use the Q&A function, and I guess, Abby, are you going to get those and funnel them to me? Is that how we're going to, or am I going to see the Q&A? To you and then, okay. All right, and then, oh, you'll ask the question even better. Okay, so on to our panelists. I'll just introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And the order will be a sort of big picture overview, then a perspective from the state level, then a perspective from the level of the municipality, the city of Boston in particular. These are amazing people. I'm going to apologize to them because in the interest of time, I'm going to shorten their bios just a little bit. I know them all, and I know that they're modest, and I'm going to take the liberty of assuming they're not going to be offended by this, so thank you in advance. Don Kerwin is a senior research associate in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He's the executive editor and founder of the Journal on Migration and Human Security. For those with research projects, by the way, that's a very excellent journal, and there's a lot of good, credible work there. And he's a senior fellow at Emory University Center for the Study of Law and Religion. For many years, he served as executive director of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network and vice president for programs at the Migration Policy Institute, and more recently as the executive director of the Center for Migration Studies in New York, an excellent, highly regarded and venerable institution. He's served on more boards and commissions and so forth than I can name. He's been actively engaged in these issues for at least now, what is it, 75 years, I think?
As long as you have.
Yeah, as long as I have. Okay, good. So we're really lucky to have him, and I welcome him back. Our second speaker will be Susan Church, who joined the Office for Refugees and Immigrants as Chief Operating Officer. She's an immigration attorney who's been an advocate for immigrant rights since 1998, when she was persuaded to go off the wayward path that she'd been on and get on the boat of doing immigrant rights work. She established her own firm, Domestic Church, where she specialized in federal and criminal-related litigation. She successfully sued the Trump administration in 2017, obtaining one of the first travel ban victories in the country, and again in 2018, returning a family separated by the Trump's family separation policy. She's well known, I would say at this point, actually somewhat legendary, for her amazing pro bono work throughout Massachusetts. She's won many awards, served as chair of the American Immigration Lawyers Association of New England from 2017 to 2018, and is a advisory board member now. Aren't
What,
you?
Ayla?
Oh, a mentor. No, you're
Rappaport
mentor,
member,
yeah. Okay. And finally, but definitely not least, the director of the Office of Housing Stability, Danielle Johnson, works to help Boston residents stay stably housed, leads research on best practices, creates recommendation, and implements new and improved policies and programs to make sure that Boston residents can stay in their homes, and this includes working with immigrant communities, of course. She previously served as managing attorney of the Elder Health and Disability Unit at GBLS, that's Greater Boston Legal Services. She has published work in the Boston Bar Journal and the Boston Globe, is an adjunct professor at Northeastern University and Suffolk University Law School, and as you will hear, currently works for the city of Boston on many of these issues. So we should have a very wide-ranging perspective, starting with a kind of big picture, national and historical overview, then talking about policies at the state level, then talking about the city level, and then we'll sort of loop back and try to weave all these things together into some sort of coherent narrative. Please welcome our speakers, and then turn it over to Don.
Thanks, Dan. Dan and I have been partners in crime for a long, long time now, so it's great to be here at the Rappaport Center and with Dan in particular. So I thought I'd start at the U.S.-Mexico border, since the border always seems to be at the center of kind of the U.S. immigration debates. The Border Patrol tends to get all of the attention, but it's actually the ports of entry that are the locus of drugs and illicit monies and concerns about who's actually coming into the country. Customs and Border Protection Southwest border encounters have been way up over the last 3 years. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody that pays attention to the news. In 2021, they were almost 2 million. 2022, 2.8 million. 2023, 3.2 million. And in the first couple of months this year, they're on a path to reach 3.7, 3.8 million if it keeps up. An encounter is not an apprehension, right? But the volume is clearly high and it's growing at the border. Migrants, let's be clear about that. Migrants are mostly coming and presenting themselves to border officials and requesting asylum. Okay, that's what is really happening. Besides the high numbers, there's been an increase in encounters of what the Border Patrol calls family units. In 2023, it was 1 million people in family units. And that trend seems to be continuing this year as well. There's also a rising number of encounters of people from what are deemed other countries. In other words, not kind of the main source countries to the United States. It's not the hyper-diversity that's being reported in the media, but it's a trend nonetheless, from about 17,500 from these other countries to 173,000 last year. Still, most of the people that are entering are from 10 countries, the top 10 countries, 70% from the top 10 in 2022, 66% in 2023, and Mexico is overwhelmingly the largest country. I'm not going to go through the countries, but you can guess what they are. You wouldn't be surprised by them. CMS, my former agency, is soon going to be reporting the first increase in the U.S. undocumented population in many years. And it's not as high as the encounter numbers would lead you to believe. It's going to be about 650,000 in the undocumented population. I think I fault the administration for not providing a good explanation of why the number of encounters has increased so dramatically. I heard things like, quoted by DHS, that it's a problem of travel agents, or that it's something that the U.S. government can't stop. It's smugglers who are duping migrants or whatever it might be. all of the literature shows and all of the interviews that I've ever done show that migrants know the risks that they're running pretty well, and it's not just those coming to the United States, it's around the world. They know them from family, they know them from communities, they know them from the press. So what is it? I mean, I think we know that cartels and gangs have overrun many migrant-sourced communities, and even in a couple of cases, entire nations, perhaps. You also have Venezuela's economic collapse, Nicaragua's descent into authoritarianism, Haiti is really a kind of a failed state. In Guatemala, there's climate displacement. There's all of these kinds of big root causes out there, systemic causes. However, what jumps out to me in looking at the numbers, and I'm sure my colleagues will add some factors to this list. One is the aftermath of COVID-19 and the way that unleashed, pent-up demand to migrate, and the way that people weren't getting as friendly a reception as they were before, is when COVID hit. And then I think the second, which gets less attention, is the fact that you have kind of many in Congress and many in the media really saying 24/7 in lockstep that the border is open, right? And if that's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, I don't know what is. I mean, if you're a migrant out there wondering whether to come, and you're hearing this over and over and over again, that the border is open, maybe you decide, okay, maybe this is the right moment for me. But whatever the cause, the impact of increased arrivals on federal agencies has been really immense. It's been extraordinary. The immigration court backlog increased by 672,000 over the last year. It took until 2017 for the overall immigration court backlog to reach 672,000. And what you're seeing is a one-year increase last year of 672,000 cases. So the backlog now is 2.5 million. The asylum backlogs alone in the immigration system, both affirmative cases, not in removal proceedings, and defensive cases in removal proceedings, now exceed 2 million cases. Beyond asylum seekers, you have, maybe 600,000 people with temporary protected status, hundreds of thousands of parolees from Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Central America, and other places. And yet, there's no organized federal program to meet their basic needs, even basic stabilization services. I'm not even talking about a full-fledged resettlement program. There's nothing like that out there that's federally funded or supported. I know we'll hear from the panelists who are the real experts here, what's happening locally. And I know FEMA money has been available, and there's other things that the federal government is doing, but it's not enough, okay? I was recently looking at the history of the 1980 Refugee Act, which created the U.S. refugee resettlement system. And even then, people were raising issues about, okay, you created a resettlement system for people from abroad, but what about all the asylum seekers? What about everybody else in the country that's kind of fleeing refugee-like conditions? What about for them? And the fact that there hasn't been in 45 years or 44 years an infrastructure for those folks is really an immense problem. It's kind of the chickens coming home to roost. In terms of state and local issues, by way of background, I see kind of 4 very consequential developments over the last 30 years or so, I guess. I think the first is the federal-local partnerships on immigration enforcement, and that really took off in the 1996 Immigration Act with the creation of the so-called 287G program. We can talk about some of these in questions or answers or whatever. And then it skyrocketed with the establishment of the Secure Communities program, which came into effect around 2008. And what that was kind of an information sharing program between the immigration databases and the FBI databases. So the locals, as they book people, all of a sudden immigration enforcement is knowing about that somebody's been arrested. So those were 2 huge developments. The second, I think, major development involved the state and local laws during the Obama administration, that tried to make life so unlivable for the undocumented that they would simply self-deport. These laws are important to remember because they remain the gold standard for many states and jurisdictions. And let me just outline some of the provisions of one of them that was struck down. But it was kind of a model, and there were several like this. And this was Alabama's HB 56. This is some of what it would have done. It sought to criminalize and prohibit the failure to carry federal documents, registration documents, work by an unauthorized immigrant, entering a rental agreement with an unauthorized immigrant, business transactions between unauthorized immigrants and the state or its political subdivisions, including for payment of water, gas, and electricity bills. It would have prevented the enforcement of contracts between undocumented immigrants and others. It would have barred courts from considering evidence of lawful immigration status by persons alleged by immigration officials to be undocumented. It would have required public schools to determine whether an enrolling student was born outside the United States or had an unauthorized parent. And it would have required schools to identify and report on unauthorized children in their schools and to analyze the financial costs of educating them. That's about half of the provisions, or maybe a third of them. I mean, you get the idea, right? The third, and it's what I'm pointing to here, is a real division in the country. So we've learned about sanctuary, and we've learned about Arizona and those attrition kind of laws. The third major state and local development, or the third, is the sanctuary jurisdictions that refuse to participate in federal enforcement partnerships. And that led to fewer interior removals than the Trump administration wanted, for sure. And I think a very interesting finding that I've just seen on a sanctuary paper, soon to be released, is that men in particular aren't aware if they live in sanctuary jurisdictions or not. Basically, they don't know. So their trust in local law enforcement doesn't hinge on whether they think that there's going to be cooperation between their jurisdiction and the federal government on enforcement. That's a real kind of large finding, I think, that maybe we can tease out a little bit. And then the fourth development, just kind of winding up here, is the busing strategy, coupled with a law in Florida that's kind of a self-deportation law, in part. And then Texas's law, which is more or less a border enforcement bill by the state. So we know now that very poor people, I was following it very closely in Washington. I met a few times with people that were running the response in Washington, D.C., and following it a bit in Chicago and in New York a bit. But we know that very poor people are being bused and that many don't have the U.S. ties that past groups have had in terms of family ties and a ready job and good prospects and the like. We also know that states and localities aren't the only groups that are busing people north. And so you might ask, well, what's the difference, say, between the church groups that provide humanitarian services to border crossers and help them to reach their destinations? They help with busing, they help with food, they help with diapers, they help with, whatever it might be, money. In Texas, Florida, and the others. And I think one difference is the reaction to them. You have far-right lawmakers who want to strip these charitable agencies of tax-exempt status for providing basic humanitarian services, but they're applauding what Texas and Arizona, Florida, and other jurisdictions are doing. The second difference, Texas and Florida are deliberately not coordinating or coordinating very poorly with receiving jurisdictions and agencies. In Chicago, until recently, they were letting migrants out of buses at night in the suburban Chicagoland communities, and the governor himself basically wrote Governor Abbott and asked for mercy. I'm coming from South Bend, Indiana. I can tell you the high some of the days recently has been 10 below zero. So, I mean, they're really, really worried that people, as they're released from buses in the middle of the night, will freeze to death, with kids too, right? So what's different is they're really trying to cause havoc in sister communities, sister U.S. communities. And it's all for political gain, and it's all with the intention to expose and punish the so-called sanctuary jurisdictions for their hypocrisy. But you know, the thing is that the sanctuary jurisdictions aren't hypocritical. They've been receiving migrants all along. I mean, they have strong immigrant communities, and the response has been strong. But it is a huge challenge. I got to say, for Texas and Arizona and Florida in particular, which isn't even a border state, remember? He's literally going to El Paso and border states to try to find migrants to bus up. I mean, that's an amazing thing, DeSantis. It's the most unpatriotic thing I can imagine, because it's jurisdictions making life difficult, horribly, trying to make it as difficult as possible for other jurisdictions. And of course, it's using human beings as political instruments. Just as laying razor wire in the Rio Grande, which is actually entangling now children and others, is doing. So it's really part and parcel of the same strategy, and I've got to say to those places, shame on you, and to those particular members that are doing that, shame on you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about this from the state perspective. I don't know how many of you know this, but Massachusetts has a unique law. It's the only law in the country which is a right to shelter law just for families for the entire state. So Denver has a right to shelter law for, I believe it's adults and families. New York has a right to shelter law for absolutely anybody. We are the only state in the country that has a right to shelter law for families for the entire state. And today the Herald called for an end to our right to shelter law. But it is one of the many factors about why Massachusetts is now receiving, I would say it's fair share of immigrants, but a large amount of immigrants. The population that we are seeing come here through, from my experience, well, let me talk about the shelter system first. So in the shelter system, we are seeing a huge percentage of Haitians. Most of these Haitians, especially starting at the beginning of the summer in June, entered the United States through this program called the CBP-1 app. So this is an app that you can download on your phone. You put your information in it and your family's information in it. You wait. You know, at the beginning, the wait for the border entry of the CBP-1 app was like 6 months. So people were sitting in Mexico trying to get onto their phones to get this app to work, to get themselves an appointment. It was a really horrific process. My understanding now is that wait has gone way down, and so if you can get on the app and get it to work and navigate it because it's in multiple languages, you get an appointment and you present to the border and you come in. That is a massive advantage for Massachusetts, that we are attracting that particular group of immigrants, because what it means, yay, is that they can immediately file for work authorization. By contrast, New York City is dealing with over 30 different languages, right? Like, just from a state policy perspective, getting enough lawyers, interpreters, translator to speak 30 different languages and provide legal services to them it has kept me up in the middle of the night. That we are not in that situation, and I don't know how we would solve it, because right now what the state is doing and what the state is prioritizing is reaching out to all of these immigrants in the shelters, like trying to reach every single person in a shelter, which is a huge mandate, and provide them legal services, to give them work authorization. If asylum application is your pathway to work authorization, we will file that for you. But if you had to add on to that mandate 30 different languages, lawyers' experience for that, I think it's pretty overwhelming. So that's our first big pathway, is the CBP-1 app. And it's been, I certainly know that advocates have been against it, but it is an advantage to Massachusetts that most of our people are using that app. And then there's another Biden program called CHNV parole, which is Cuban, Haitian, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan parole. It's only limited to those individuals from those countries. We're not seeing any of those people in our shelters, maybe like one or two. You know, it's miraculous the difference in populations and the pathways that they follow. So CHNV parole is where a family member, friend, you know, if you're lucky, you know somebody who's got a nice big house, they petition for you and your family to come to the United States. they have to, and it's not the usual pathways to the United States through family petitions where you end up with a green card. You just end up with 2 years of parole. And they have to show they have a certain amount of money in the bank. We used to kind of advise, like, I have $70,000 in the bank. Not many, or $70,000 annual income a year, and have at least $5,000 to $10,000 in a bank. You file this application, and then if you are successful, you can just reunite with a family, and you get 2 years of parole. Because it's Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelan, that means they have 2 years really to file their parole, their asylum application. And then they can probably maintain their status for a significant period of time, hopefully resulting in an asylum grant or marriage or another of options. So it's miraculous to me to the difference between those two programs and why they result in such different results, different pathways into the state help. And I think part of that is the culture surrounding CHMV is you cannot use state resources if you use this method. And they don't, that's not legal, that's not required, but that's what people follow. So I just want to highlight, it is a very new, I've been in immigration field for many, many years, and many of our clients come to the United States. They have a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a brother, and they sleep on their couch for 3, 6, 9 months. They get a job, and then they move out, right? That was the pathway. This is not all of them, of course, but this is a large percentage of immigrants with absolutely no contacts in the United States whatsoever. So how are they coming to Massachusetts? Like, how are they getting here then if they don't know anybody? And miraculously, it's social media. WhatsApp, TikTok. There are videos just on repay through the community saying, like, Massachusetts has a right to shelter law, Massachusetts will give you housing, and so people are coming in. They're coming from Florida too. We are getting our highest category of people who have come and been in another state for it. So kind of the highest category of people in shelters is coming from another state. If they're not just new arrivals, they've been in another state for a very short period of time, and then they come here, and a lot of them are from Florida. And the data I'm kind of citing is really a snapshot of data from one of our shelters that I'm extrapolating for all of the shelters, so we don't know, because we don't have this data on everything, but this is one of the interesting things I found from it. So I am really puzzled by this brand new crop of immigrants many of them have been in Brazil or Chile for many years, so there was a huge problem with Chile where Chile asked all of their immigrants to leave, not asked, I say that nicely, but kicked them out essentially. And Brazil, there were some violent attacks on Haitian immigrants, so a lot of them were living there and left and come here, which of course then makes their asylum app super challenging because there's a rule called firm resettlement in asylum, and if you're in another country and you are given status in that country, even if that's not a great country to be in, you have to prove to the judge that you still have fear of returning to Haiti and that country. So the firm resettlement bar has a lot of problems that are going to be bigger problems for these families when they go for asylum. The abilities of the immigrants, I guess, is to say there are people in our shelters who don't have any language skills other than Haitian Creole and cannot read. And then there are immigrants in our shelters who speak Spanish, who speak Portuguese, who speak Haitian Creole. And my favorite example is the forklift operator who speaks Haitian Creole and Spanish, is almost fluent in Portuguese, but he's not quite there. And he started learning English, but he was a forklift operator in Haiti, and he's like, well, I'm not going to have time to learn English before I get a job, so I will use Google Translate to apply to become a forklift operator and to pass the test, the certification test. And within like 2 weeks, he had filled out the application to take the forklift operator exam, passed the forklift operator exam, and then was like asking us, where's my work authorization? Like, if there's anyone on the earth I can get a work authorization pass for, it's you. So you just really it's such a gamut of people and it's such an array, which makes things challenging. Just a good time. All right. So this summer, so really I started working at the Office for Refugee and Immigrants this summer, and what our job there is to help coordinate the new arrivals, which is a really large definition. Our governor has always been an extreme advocate for immigrants as Attorney General. She and I worked very closely together on all the litigation, including the Trump litigation, including family separation. And I'm just going to divert a little bit because I remember, and this is to when you're thinking about going into government, this is the reason I took this job, is because I was in a meeting with her and my family separation client had been giving an affidavit to her lawyers, and she came down to meet this client. And every time I tell the story once, I get a little bit teary, but it was horribly emotional, right? Like, she had not been reunited with her child yet. We were filing a lawsuit to get reunited. The AG's office was filing a separate lawsuit, and our client had been crying. It was just an awful situation. And Governor Healy comes down, and she looks at my client, and she says, I know that the people who did this to you were the government. I know that they are the government, but I want you to know that I'm the government too. These people here sitting next to you, they are the government too. And you just remember that the next time you think about government and the harm that government has done to you, we're also the good part of the government. And I think that's really, really symbolic about what's going on right now, right? Like, there are the Texas people and there are the Massachusetts people. It doesn't mean that that has not been a massive challenge dealing with this summer. At some point in time, on any given day, 40 families would show up at one of our 2 family welcome centers and ask for housing that night. And the state does not keep 40 rooms on stock to just put people in. And so it was and we can't financially do that, so it was like a day-to-day struggle every day, sometimes up to 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, trying to find hotels that would take these families. And that, in and of itself, is its own challenge. And I like to talk about the difference in the hotels. So there was a hotel in Mansfield that, I am not exaggerating, the hotel manager would call me 10 times a day to try to figure out how he could help the migrants in his hotel. He would buy them food, he would get them Ubers, somebody's sick. It was unbelievable what he did. He was so happy to be helpful. And then there was the hotel in Dedham. And we booked the hotels, we used an online system, they were fully and 100% legal. The families showed up, the front desk manager saw the families, and refused to let them into the hotel. And they never called me, even though we had booked the hotel. They called some other state person who did not answer the phone, and the manager would not let them sleep in their hotel rooms that were legally and fully booked, and the family slept in the lobby for the evening. So that is the range of responses to this crisis that you will see, which again is about the divisions in this country. Very similar for towns. So in Massachusetts, it's unique that we have over 100 towns. I think we're down now because we've consolidated, but at the height of this, over the summer, there were over 100 towns who had a hotel with immigrants inside the hotel, which is really mind-boggling if you think of it from a logistical viewpoint, right? And just to give you a picture, anybody from Massachusetts here? Okay. Anyone know Plainville? Ever heard of Plainville? It's a small town, right? There's one hotel in Plainville with 170 families in it right now, which if you multiply that by 3.6, which is the ratio, it's about 3.6. I don't know what the math is, but that's a lot of people for a town to absorb and to take in. So there are some towns that are not happy, and they will call and complain. And then there are towns like Foxborough, who called us up and yelled at us, not because they were not happy they were adding immigrants, but because they had prepared gift bags over a week ago, and they didn't know why the immigrants were not in the hotel. So it's really, to me, that whole just like dichotomy between like, why is Foxborough happy and why is this town unhappy, and it was crazy. So Dan, in my last couple minutes, wanted me to talk about changing from lawyer to advocate. And I'll say that's been a challenge in and of itself, because I do think that this governor hired 3 really long-term immigrant advocates to take over the Office of Refugee and Immigrants, which says a lot. So Ronnie Millar is our chief strategist, essentially. Christina Aguilera-Sandoval is our executive director, and I'm the chief operating officer. And all 3 of us spent all of our working lives in the immigrant field. So there's reception and warmth for advocates, but there are limits, right? Government is It weighs on you, I guess is the way to do it. Getting through government processes is not a simple matter. It's very challenging to get anything done, really. It's like, it takes a lot of effort. And it's not, and I've been really seeing why. And honestly, the reason why is they have hired a lot of really talented, smart people who see every asterisk on every plan, right? Like, that's not me. I'm like, here's the plan, we're gonna do it. You know me, right? Mary's laughing at me because my thing's like, here, we're gonna do this. And everybody's like, what about this? What about this? What about that? We'll figure it out, we'll figure it out. That's not the way state government operates. State government figures out every single asterisk down to a T and wants to stop whatever you're doing until everything's done. And hey, is that such a bad thing? I don't know, but that is why things take so much time. And
It's
so
called
that,
the rule of law.
yeah. Oh, that's the worst. The lawyers, they're the worst in government. That's actually I'm trying to launch a program on Tuesday called Lawyer for a Day, where we'll provide lawyers to immigrants as basically at the front door. And I was all ready to go, and I was so happy. I was like, yes, we've got this off the ground. And then the lawyer's like, no, you've done this wrong. Da, da, da. I was like, ah! So it's really fun. So those are kind of the downsides of working in state government, which you just have to have patience with. I have none, so I'm getting through that. The upside is you really get so much done, like so much more than I could ever dream of, one client at a time, one case at a time. To have like that large, just for example, in late October, the federal government came to the state and said, we want to help, what can we do? Let's do a legal clinic, right? I don't know, you may have heard about this program, but it was a legal clinic to get because we had this backlog in the system of people who needed work authorization, and they were like, we're just going to run through everybody in 1 week, and then it turned out 2. And so, this is late October. By November 13th, we had a week-long clinic where, I don't know, over 50 lawyers from around the state came in and volunteered. Countless non-lawyers. It was a ridiculous amount of people, and we got 1,200 work authorization applications filed and 1,900 people to get biometrics. And if you practice immigration law, just getting biometrics done for a person in a homeless shelter, just one, is like you can just take the week off. To get 1,900 done is just unbelievable. So that was great. We're doing this Lawyer for a Day program, so those are really like, the trade-off is big, but those are the big ups and downs of it.
Susan is very animated, so I can only hope that I can match that energy. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and to the Rappaport Center for having us. As Susan had mentioned, the state is primarily tasked with ensuring that families enter into their emergency assistance shelter program. The city, we pride ourselves with handling the individual, so we have various individual shelters scattered throughout the city. And I think for this conversation, it's helpful to guide or to think about the history and how the city of Boston even came about to be not only on this panel, but involved in this crisis. So as Susan had mentioned, around 2022, late 2022, early 2023, we started to hear rumblings from different hospitals. We have these families that are hanging out in our lobby. We can keep them temporarily, but we need to find somewhere else for them to go, just because this isn't the proper place for them to be. In my office, being one that provides assistance for families who are seeking shelter temporarily until they're able to enter into the EA shelter system, we're saying, okay, let's take them temporarily while we figure out the state piece. And then that become a deluge, where it was 10 families, then 20 families, 30 families, up to 40 families, as Susan mentioned. And that became something that we just could not sustain anymore. So we had to strategize, and I think a big part of what we've heard from both our panelists today is, how do we build the plane as we're flying it, right? Just because there have been a lot of families that have shown up, and there hasn't been a lot of opportunity to take a step back and think, okay, how do we strategize? How do we plan? To your point about bureaucracies, it's very hard to get things done when there are various procedures that are in place, or if you're being presented with a sort of new issue. I don't think the influx of a group of people coming to a neighborhood or to a city or state is new, but given the times, pandemic into relaxed pandemic structures, that created, whoa, we're not equipped for this, we need to lean on our federal partners, we need to lean in on our state partners, and that in and of itself created some issues and created some learning moments, I think, in terms of how we work together and understanding what our priorities are and understanding who is tasked with what. But one of the things that we focused on from the city perspective is we obviously want to be good neighbors. We rely on the state very heavily. They fund us for a lot of the work that we do. So how can we support them while also understanding that the city of Boston and our constituents need assistance as well? So mitigating those different responses, as Susan had mentioned, there was a dichotomy of us versus them. My office would receive numerous calls that were laced with xenophobia of, how is this family, they're not even from here, and they're getting all of these resources, but I've been a City of Boston resident for 10 years, and I can't even access this type of resource. So trying to have that conversation over the phone with someone who is just as much in dire straits as someone who has recently arrived. So again, thinking of different ways that we could build the plane, what parts are we missing? So one thing that we focused on from our Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, given that's their niche, immigration, I must say, is not my niche. I've steered clear from it for all my legal career for obvious reasons, as Susan had explained, but this was a great opportunity to really get a crash course into immigration law and all of the multi-facets of immigration. I still will have a lot of questions for you. But one of the things that we thought about, one thing that we are very heavy on within the city, and Mayor Wu has been a huge proponent of, is cultural competency, making sure that we are a welcoming city and continue to be a welcoming city, regardless of whether or not we have the resources to support anyone that's coming into the city. So whether that was, okay, we house these families temporarily, what types of food do families prefer? Instead of thinking, okay, we'll just get the McDonald's or we'll give them an Uber gift card and tell them good luck. Really figuring out what are the other resources that are available if their children want to play, where are some places, local BCYF centers, that we can provide those resources to families. Again, understanding that this is a new environment for a lot of families who have no connections. One of the things, or one of the frequent messaging that we received when we were meeting with families was, someone sponsored me to come here, I slept for a day, and then they told me I had to leave, and that was a pattern that we were seeing very frequently and that the hospitals were reporting to us. So that was one major focus that the city tried to do, is making sure that any services that we provided were culturally competent, while also making sure that we're focusing on City of Boston residents who have been here for 20 years, letting them know that, hey, we haven't lost focus of your needs. We're still focusing on building affordable housing, which is what the Mayor's Office of Housing is tasked with doing. We're still making sure that tenants, your tenancies are stabilized. We're still making sure that we're having conversations with property management, development companies to make sure that they are providing sustainable housing to you. Making sure that people knew that we could do two things at once, albeit difficult. And then another thing that we really focused on was working with our state partners, because that is an important function. As Susan mentioned, there was an influx and an influx and an influx, and it got to a point where the state could not contain that anymore, and they needed support from the city. And as I mentioned, we usually focus on individuals, so whether that's connecting them with the local shelter or working with Boston Public Health Commission to make sure that they have access, if not to a shelter, to another resource. It became, we understand that maybe congregate shelters aren't the best setting for a family with a 2-year-old, so figuring out what the resources were, and frequent communication with the state. Weekly, still we have conversations and meet weekly to go over the numbers, to figure out, okay, what are we saying, how can the city support, and that's where we are currently. So I wanted to talk about where we were and how we've gotten here, and essentially how the city has come to be involved. But also wanted to note that there have been some pitfalls and some issues along the way, understandably so, because again, this has been a new, quasi-new environment for us, and that we were not prepared, candidly, and we had to think of ways on the fly that we could become actively prepared. So I really appreciate the state's interaction with the city. As Don had mentioned, the federal government did provide some funding to us, and the money piece is important, because without money, we're a capitalistic society. You're not able to do all of the things that you want to do. So through ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funding, through the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, we were able to purchase hotel rooms here and there. But again, once the money runs out, it becomes a task of, well, how can we help in other ways, or are there other resources that we can tap into? So that's where we are right now, with figuring out what other resources are there and leaning into our federal partners and making sure that, as Dawn had mentioned, it's very clear that there is a need. It's a matter of, well, who's going to be responsible for what? There's also a question of, well, are we being territorial in terms of, well, New York is getting this, Denver is getting that, what is Massachusetts getting, and how are we competing when we should actually be thinking, okay, from a higher perspective, which is more, I think, and maybe Susan will agree, is more of a federal decision that should be made. Before I end, I do want to end, because part of this panel is also about compassion and empathy, and I think it's important. I mentioned earlier around cultural competency and understanding the community, and one shoe doesn't fit all, but I wanted to end with a quote from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's a Nigerian author. She has a great TED Talk called Dangers of a Single Story. It's something that I force my students reluctantly to watch, but it's a really great purview into how these types of migration stories can affect a person's mind in terms of xenophobia, in terms of thinking, oh, well, this is their problem and not our problem, when we are a nation of one. So Chimamanda states, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of the people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So I just wanted to end with that, and thank you all for your attention today.
Well, thank you all. That was incredibly enlightening. I feel in the room that there's probably a lot of questions and comments, and I want to make maximum availability for that. So rather than doing some of the more specific follow-up that I'd envisioned, what I'd like to do is give each panelist just a minute or two. If you want to respond to something that somebody else has said, let's do that in now. And then I want to ask two big follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up. The two questions are this. We've been focusing a lot on the challenges of this, but I know in Germany, for example, and in many other countries, there's also been much more governmental attention to the benefits of migration, even undocumented migration, even challenging migration of the type that we've seen. And what do you think will be the benefits if we're thinking 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? People may not know this, but every study that's ever been done has shown the benefits of immigration to any community in which there's been immigration. Crime rates are lower, students are more engaged in school, energy is greater, so it's almost inevitably been a benefit. And I'm wondering how you feel about that. And the second is a more negative question, which is how do you feel the Biden administration really has performed on this? Don talked a little bit about the messaging. Susan had that wonderful story that, the counter to Ronald Reagan's famous line about the 9 scariest words in the English language were "we're from the government and we're here to help." That's a very cynical view. There's a positive side to government, and without government, what have we got? We've got a mess, an anarchic, chaotic, dangerous mess with children freezing in the cold. Can't have that. But how would you grade the Biden administration? So those are my two questions to the panelists, but why don't we go around, if there's something you wanted to say but didn't have a chance to say, let's do it in the same order we did before, or respond to each other, and if you could just weigh in on those questions. And then I will take questions from the audience, and I will say I'm going to give preference to students because even though we have amazing colleagues here, and I apologize to them, I think we're really here for the students first. So if you're a student and you have a question, we'll get to you first, and then we'll open it up to colleagues. John?
I mean, I have, of course, I have lots of questions for my colleagues here, but I just maybe just lift up a couple of things that they said that I thought were really important. This issue of kind of the use of social media, I think, is something that needs like lots and lots more attention, because I've heard that too, and people are seeing it all over the world. With Syrian refugees, with Venezuelan refugees, it's kind of a new thing. WhatsApp in particular. But then to tie that to people that have no connections at all so that they can access benefits, that I think is like a super important development. So thank you for that. Danielle's point of, what it raised for me is, yes, the need to recognize that people here do have needs, and that it's not a balancing issue, but it's kind of an and type of issue. Immigrants have particular needs, but there's a lot of people in line too with real needs, and you have to kind of honor both of those and figure out a way to meet them both. And then for both of them, I have kind of a question, which might be an indelicate question, which is like, is there coordination among the receiving communities in terms of an approach to the federal government, or conversations with the federal government on kind of the needs of communities and how the federal government might meet them? I think, Dan, on your question, long term, how this program might work, I think some of it kind of depends on the services that people are receiving right now, including kids being enrolled in school and the like. So that it really, really matters what's happening in Massachusetts and Boston and all of these jurisdictions right now. We, as you may know, we've done lots and lots of studies using census data showing the many contributions of the undocumented over time, and how those contributions and the ability to contribute jump with each move into status. If you move from undocumented to legal permanent resident to citizenship, it's just kind of remarkable. And we've also done that with refugees, looking at 1.1 million refugees who were resettled in the U.S. over 30 years, and looking at the 3 cohorts, 10-year cohorts of those. And the oldest cohort inevitably does better than kind of natives in the United States. So I think, yes, there's a lot of opportunities here, and it's good to keep that in mind, that ultimately this will be good for the country. But what happens now does matter quite a bit, I think. Thank you.
I would just echo that. Thank you. I definitely would. I'm going to start from the backwards and go forwards, because I don't like to follow rules, as Dan noted.
Or even suggestions.
Yeah. I would definitely echo that. I think we cannot fail these families. And if we fail these families as a state, as a city, as a country, we are creating 10 times the problems that we would have if we would get kids, I will say the state is really concentrating on getting kids enrolled in school, getting kids legal services. We are, as a state, we have ESOL programs that are launching that will be into English as a second language, that will hopefully be at almost every shelter. So we know that if you put those investments in now, all you have to do is Google how many Fortune 500 companies are run by either immigrants or children of immigrants, right? It's extraordinary. The people that, I think you all know this, but the people who make their way to this country, either through the Darien Gap or by visa or whatever, are the people that you want in this country. It's extremely difficult to get here. It's not an easy thing to leave your entire country behind. We were having a conversation the other day about culturally confident food. And, immigrants not eating pizza that's given to them. And what do you do about that? It's like, you literally left everything in your world behind, and then you show up here and somebody gives you pizza, right? Like, it's just so difficult to do what these families are doing, that we know if they're treated right and with respect, they are going to excel. So, yes, I think it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. And I'll quote my executive director with that. As far as reflecting off of what you both said, I definitely agree that we need to start looking at asylum seekers the same way we treat refugees. Refugees come to the United States, they get housing assistance, they get job assistance, they get ESOL assistance, they get cash payments for a month.
So let me just clarify for people who are not experts. Refugees come from abroad.
Right.
They apply from outside the United States. They come in refugee status. Asylum seekers are people who come here and then claim that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, and then there's an adjudicative process. So that it's just 2 different pathways. But the underlying law is the same law.
Exactly.
The nature of it.
The status is the same, the claims are the same, the facts are usually very similar, if not the same. So I do think that's something we need to rethink our immigration system, equating the two. And then to play a little bit off of what Danielle said, I do think we need as much state and city coordination as possible, because it's such a huge problem.
And I'll just briefly add, in terms of the positives of multiple families, individuals coming into not only Massachusetts, but the city of Boston, in our conversations with various individuals and families, they all expressed, I want to work, I have a skill set, and I think it would be beneficial. The city of Boston has a lot of jobs, and we're working with our state partners and the feds for work authorization permits, also leaning into our community partners, naming a few: IFC, Immigrant Family Services Institute, Neighborhood Affordable Housing, both in areas, one Mattapan, the other East Boston, respectively, doing great work in those communities. Mattapan has a large Haitian community, East Boston has a large Latinx community, so really working with them to figure out ways that we can develop that skill set, and also in terms of working with families, and Susan brought up the story of the forklifter. We have a pilot program that we're implementing through our Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, and some of the families are living in sort of a congregate type setting, and many of the families have really come together to test out their skill sets. So we have someone that cooks, we have someone that can fix the faucet. So I think if we are looking at it from that perspective of these are people just like us, not thinking of the us versus them rhetoric, they really want to come into our communities and help. So I hope that this room, and I don't think I need to say it, is dispelling themselves of the rumors that they just want to take our jobs, because that's not the case. So I think that's one of the benefits to these families and individuals immersing themselves in the community.
Great, thank you. I will notice that my question about the Biden administration is largely unanswered, so I'm just going to say for my part, and then we'll open it up. I will say that I think we've been witnessing an absolutely shocking lack of coordination, messaging, description of what the policy is at the federal level. It's been really, really strange to me, and it's a mystery as to why they have not done a better job of explaining what their policy is, and I think it's had some terrible consequences. And that was part of the reason why we created this panel in the first place, is because so much of this has fallen to the state and local level, which is not unique historically necessarily in this country, but the complete absence of anything other than we have a broken immigration system, we need to fix it, and the Congress has been a do-nothing Congress. That's all true, but that's been true for 40 years and everybody's known it. So we need better messaging, and if anybody in the Biden administration is hearing this, I think they're knowing now in terms of the election that they need better messaging on this, because it's turning into a real political problem for them. So we'll see where that goes. All right, let's open it up for questions. I see one student in the back with a quick hand. The gentleman in the back, please. And please identify yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan O'Malley. Thank you for organizing this today. Is there an argument that governors or state legislatures could provide state-level work authorization similar to the state-by-state legalization of cannabis and driver's license, which seems to have avoided a Commerce Clause smackdown?
Yeah, that's a fantastically interesting question, and I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I'm going to defer to the panelists on this. It's a really good question. Thank you.
I mean, it's a supremacy clause issue, but I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about it, Dan. I haven't thought about it much.
Well, there is a movement already in California. They've started doing some research into it, and it's certainly been talked about by multiple states. One of the thoughts was that can we hire state employees and give them state work authorization, so they're only employed through the state, and whether that might somehow get around the supremacy clause. So that's been one argument I've heard. It's definitely, I think, people are discussing it.
I would add, when I first started practicing in this realm, which was a long time ago, employment authorization was actually not federalized, and people in Massachusetts could work in the state even if they were out of status. So this federalization of employment authorization was a product of the reforms that Don was talking about through the 80s and then the early 90s. It's a fairly recent development. And it was part of a statutory scheme I always thought there's some serious constitutional questions about whether the federal government should have the exclusive authority to do this. One can make police power arguments, you can make 10th Amendment arguments. I think there is some fruitful thinking that could be done there. It would require a kind of watershed rethinking by the Supreme Court about the relative competence of the federal and state governments, and this administration is not going to support that because they're engaged in a fight with Texas right now. You know, they just won at the Supreme Court, vindicating this idea of the federal government preempting the field entirely. So we'll see what happens with the California initiative. I would like people in Massachusetts to think a little bit more about this. I know some are, and there might be some test cases that we could think about there. It's not unthinkable at all.
Dan?
Yes.
Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Elijah, I'm at 3L. I'm wondering, looking forward, one can imagine the current situation just becoming more entrenched, right? That red states continue to be this very harsh place to send people away to, places like Massachusetts or New York. Are any of your works centered around working with reasonable people in some of these states and or thinking about how to not prevent that future from happening? Because that's a scary future if that's the case.
Yeah, where's the Reasonable People Coalition? Have you found any?
I mean, is the question government types and?
Government types or from policy folks, like, is that?
Well, I mean, of course, in all of those places, there's strong pro-immigrant coalitions and community groups, and so that exists all across the country, Texas, Arizona, all of those jurisdictions. Like in Texas, for example, one of my agencies ran the office in El Paso for years and years, and so we got to know all of those community groups and worked very, very closely with them, including on the board. And a regular person that came to meetings was Beto O'Rourke at that time, So, I mean, there's political movements in all of these places. But, I don't know I'm not kind of a political type, so I'm not really sure kind of what the possibilities are politically. But yes, there's all sorts of strong immigrant coalitions.
I mean, I think I would just add that, and Danielle and I are trying to figure out the exact number, but the National Governors Association, I think there's maybe one or two Republicans on that entire group, and that used to be a bipartisan group, and it's gone down to absolutely none. Do you know how many? I think there's one or two Republicans left on, so it's pretty dismal out there for bipartisan working together.
And just from the city's perspective, when we started to see an influx of families coming into individual shelters, but the hospitals as well, our Office of Emergency Management is usually the one that's tasked with figuring out, oh, this is an emergency, let me speak to this neighboring town or city. And one of the things that the chief at that time was doing was reaching out to this air quote reasonable cohort of other OEM-like entities in other states. But to your question, and I think to your point, there is a need for better cohesiveness in that realm, given the numbers that Dan just cited, of figuring out, okay, this may become an issue. We saw Martha's Vineyard, how that came about. So really putting our efforts and focusing our efforts, obviously from the city's perspective, federal issues, we may not have much pull, but we can obviously speak to federal partners and state partners and advocate for what's needed.
I want to say to the students in the room, for those who are interested in these subjects, we're very lucky at Boston College to have a very robust and really excellent immigration program, which I'm proud to be a part of. And there are two other faculty members here. I see Professor Holper and Professor Rosa, who are part of this. We have a great clinical program. I teach a course in the fall. We have lots of programming through the Center for Human Rights also. I said I was going to privilege students, but I'm going to now privilege a former student who wants to say something. So Professor Holper, please.
Hi, thanks. I run the immigration clinic. Thanks, Abby. Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for just Don, I can't say enough that, shame on you for doing this is so much. I share all the sentiments. So I'm also curious about, because I could not agree more about this is not a problem, it's an opportunity. There was a Globe story last week about, great, we need so many workers. Isn't this wonderful? They're right here. They're arriving in busloads, ready and awesome workers who are going to just, immediately do whatever it needs, not snowflakey, whatever. Okay, so that's wonderful. But I'm also wondering about, I also heard a story from like who was it? The mayor of Erie, Pennsylvania, like, hey, we'd like some migrants to come to our town. So how much, if they don't have pre-existing connections, are you just like, hey, we have this amazing resource of many, many people who are being bused to our cities, Chicago, Boston, and who else would love to share in this bounty of wonderful people who are going to make your cities that much better? And then kind of like coordination across those. I also am just wondering too, because I know from my work in the immigration clinic, I have just a great story with one of our clients during the pandemic, released from detention and needed to find a place for them to live. This was a transgender client who had an asylum claim to Algeria. And my student found somebody with just like an extra room in Somerville who's like, yeah, we hate ICE. And that's why we wanted to give this client of yours somewhere to live. And it was an amazing, because like it was fall of 2020. That was a scary time to just take someone in out of immigration detention to come live at your house who you didn't even know what the whole backstory was. And that was the reasoning behind it. And I suspect there are probably a lot more folks who have those extra bedrooms, little like carriage house in the backyard. I hate ICE, I hate Governor Abbott, and I want to do something to help people. So I'm just curious about that too.
Well, yeah, but let me also raise a real concern that I have. This is all important and potentially doable in the current administration. If Trump wins the next election, some of these things are federal crimes that you're talking about, and they could prosecute people, and they will, for harboring, for transporting, for conspiracy. So you really need to be careful about this and think about this gets back to the federal versus state dilemma here. If the feds want to go after people for this, they have done that in the past. Don, I think we all know about some of the history of the prosecutions of the sanctuary movement in the Reagan administration. So just beware of this going forward.
But that's an asterisk. I want to hear from
Sorry.
But that's also, I'm sorry, that's, for the shelter population, none of these people would be charged with harboring because they're all here legally. They have
for the
PAs
people who are on parole, yes.
Anybody who's in our shelter system either has a notice to appear, has parole, or has some status in the United States. The state does not, there's no law that allows utterly unauthorized people to be in our shelters. So no harboring charges, you can take people in.
Thank you.
But I will say we have just started a host family program. I think we're up to 32 host families now that have been taken in immigrants. We have a staff member who kind of like answers all their questions and stuff like that. So the administration is definitely supportive of the host family avenue, and I think there's a lot more of that.
I would just say too that, to Mary, I just don't want to forget what she said about there's an awful lot of cities that have benefited quite a bit and that are extraordinarily happy with immigrant communities that have restored central cities, that have restored rundown neighborhoods, that have kind of revitalized them. So there is a literature out there, both kind of an academic literature and just kind of a popular literature where that's taking place. It's a really good point, important point.
I would mention Victor Wembanyama in San Antonio, for example.
I just want to briefly add to that. We've definitely had people reach out to us about that, saying, oh, this is an opportunity, but with caution, because we want to make sure that if someone is moving into a space that it is legal and it is sustainable and safe. So that's something that we are also doing education on. While we appreciate the outreach and interest in housing families, we want to make sure that we aren't just sending families to an illegal basement. So I think you have to balance both pieces, but to your point, I think it's something that, again, coordinated efforts could benefit from. But the city is definitely encouraging. We have a landlord incentive program, which provides tax credits for landlords who charge affordable rent to their tenants. So using that as a resource, we already have that infrastructure. So encouraging landlords to take that on while also focusing on the cultural competency piece and what the needs are of the families that are moving in.
So picking up on that, we have another line.
I saw, thank you.
Yeah, so someone online asked for Danielle, how well do you think that Boston is doing in meeting the needs of new immigrants and those and the residents of Boston?
Tough question.
Criticism, self-criticism.
That's for you.
Right. I'd say we're doing well, given the influx that we've seen. We've had to coordinate with not only the hospitals, community partners, but also with our state partners. We've rapidly increased our funding streams to make sure that we are providing those resources to families. Obviously, in everything that you do, there is room for improvement, but I do think given the small capacity that we have, we're a city of just shy of 700,000 people. We've been open and communicative to families. We want you here. We think you could benefit from our resources, but we also want to be explicit in what we can provide and what we can and cannot do. So overall, I think if we had to give the city of Boston a grade, I'd give them an A-, but I could be biased. So.
Do we have another question here? Yep.
Yes, hi. So my name is Jonathan Mora. I'm a senior at Boston College, and I'm interested in pursuing a career in law. And I have a deep commitment in immigration advocacy. So thank you so much for your work. As I continue in being committed to becoming an attorney, I do face constant conversations with people who have anti-immigrant beliefs. One of them being, I'm not too confident to say my roommate, but my roommate does ask me consistently about my opinions on immigration law, and policies like that. And I feel like in the future I'm going to be faced with I'm going to talk to a lot of people who have different beliefs than me. And so my question is, especially because you guys have a lot of experience in this work, is how do you have conversations with people about your work in immigration, supporting immigrants, while knowing that those people might or do have anti-immigrant beliefs?
Or maybe also beliefs about people who are violating the rule of law to be here. I mean, there are different strands of the anti-immigration argument. One of the main ones is, what part of illegal do you not understand? How do we respond to that kind of thing? That's a great question. Thank you. Don, you wrote a good article about this, I remember, some years ago.
I'm trying to remember.
Just on that question.
But what part of the human don't you understand? Human rights. I mean, there's ways easy ways to answer it. I think that yes, there's an awful lot of people that will oppose you and will be happy to disagree with you on a lot of these issues. I think that as somebody that's kind of talked to a lot of groups over the years, what I found is that you have to start at a point of values with people. In other words, what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, okay, this is what's happening at the border, and this is this is my take on the border, because that's a fight right from the start. And even if you successfully rebut what they might be thinking, they're going to get their backs up and going to be more angry, and they're going to double down on their misconceptions. So it's really important. I can do it from a religious perspective, just because that's my background and the agencies that I've worked with. These are the values that we have. This is where we're coming from a religious perspective. But then, and this is the kind of country we want to create, even if you're not religious, and it's the United States. It's a place that's unified by ideals, a commitment to shared ideals, building society together, etc. And then you talk about the importance of immigrants to the country, and I think only at the very end do you talk about the specifics of immigration policy and immigration reform. And at least if you get to that point, then you're getting a respectful conversation. Somebody's listening to you at that point, and they're not feeling threatened. They're buying into the values. They're buying into your sense of what kind of country, what kind of communities are we trying to create? Where do immigrants fit in? And then deal with the controversial stuff at the very end.
Can I add to this? So I think that's exactly right. You do have to start with the values, and when you're starting with the values and this person is like, no one unless they're white is allowed into this country, you need to just stop the conversation, right? But what I do find in the immigration field is the amount of disinformation is unbelievably shocking. Just no one understands immigration law. No one understands the process. People don't understand the numbers, and if you work as an immigrant advocate in the field, you do understand. So if you get to that tail end of that conversation, I'm sorry, you will be an extreme asset to that conversation. You will wipe the floor with that person because you really, people do not understand it. And it's just, there's no line. The list of myths out there that it's shocking. So I think if you work in the field and you you do this particular area of law, you will have a lot of knowledge that if you can get to the rational end of the conversation, you will be very successful in your conversation.
And I know I mentioned it earlier, but would recommend watching the TED Talk on dangers of a single story. I think part of it, larger picture, is thinking, what are my implicit biases and why am I thinking like this? So dispelling yourself of your own biases. We all have them. It's human nature to have them, and that's okay. But what's not okay is just accepting it and saying, well, I'm biased against immigrants, so oh well. Figuring out what that bias is and then doing something about it. So I think it's important and it's great that you're thinking about this, especially as you're matriculating as an attorney. You'll have to, and you'll come across different people, so it's important to make sure that you are having those difficult conversations ahead of time. Maybe pick a good time, maybe not the week that it's his turn to take the trash out, but figuring out the right time to have those conversations.
You know, I would also say if you're going to study law, this is a great subject to ponder, and the question about violations of law and what the proper response to those violations is a lot more complicated, like Susan was saying, than people might think. I mean, I remember when my second child was being born and my wife went into labor, I had to drive at 80 miles an hour down Starrow Drive to get to the hospital. So there I was, violating all the traffic laws, speeding, reckless driving. You know, should I have been prosecuted for that or not? Well, it depends, you know, and when the police tailed us to the hospital and they saw where we were going, the cop just parked the car and, you know, said, have a good day. A lot of these people are fleeing incredibly desperate, horrible situations, and maybe they are violating border laws, but most of them are also turning themselves in quickly to apply in the system. So it's a very complicated discussion about what it means to violate the law and what the response to that should be. So I look forward to having this conversation with you in a couple of years when you're a lawyer and with your pursuit of that goal. We have two more questions. I think one here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex. My question is, what role can the states have in helping adjudicate the asylum claims and the backlog of asylum claims?
The 2 million, the 2 million backlog problem. Yeah.
I think that's for me because you did state. The state does not have any role right now in adjudicating asylum backlog or helping with the backlog claim. We are actively trying to get asylum applications filed, which in fact contributes to the backlog, but it's the only way for many people to obtain work authorization. There certainly has been a lot of conversation among the states, well, can we, as a state, become a processing center and, you know, process the applications faster that way? But it's really in line with supremacy right now. It's a wholly federal function. It's only what they let us do for them that we're able to do.
But this backlog problem, I mean, what are the dates now? We're like 6 years out now when people are getting their claims in?
When I left practice, it was almost 7 years before you might maybe get an interview for an affirmative claim, and it's got to be worse now.
We did, and I should just to say that I spent 2 years on a report on working with a lot of people on kind of this particular issue, and we have a new version of it coming out like this upcoming week or so. But I think the thing to keep in mind about the backlog is it doesn't have necessarily much to do with the immigration judges, other than that there's way, way too few of them. It has a lot more to do with the rest of the immigration system. And I give you just a fact, you know, there's 4.2 million people in the visa backlog right now, or something like that. How many of those people do you think are in the removal backlog? You know, it's going to be a big, big number. We don't exactly know. So you see all of these kind of neuralgic problems in the overall U.S. immigration system, and the court backlog is just where those problems go home to roost. It's really a lot broader than just kind of the court system.
All right, we have time for one last question. Who is it? Yes, sir, please.
I'm Peter. I have a quick question from something that Ms. Johnson said, and so I hope it'll be pretty quick, and Ms. Church might be able to speak to it as well on a statewide level. Ms. Johnson, you mentioned balancing the needs of immigrants and migrants moving into the city with some of those perhaps lifelong residents in Boston who are upset about what they perceive as differing levels of aid and maybe immediate assistance. You mentioned that there's a significant proportion of calls with residents kind of talking about why it's fair and just and what the reasoning is behind the allocation of resources. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more. Ms. Church, on a state level, if you could do that as well, I would love to hear that.
I'd like to hear about veterans a lot, actually, is one constituency that I hear in terms of people who are unhoused.
Right, and what we have had to tell them is it's a backlog everywhere. And as I mentioned, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So one of the things that my office primarily does, well, not primarily, but we provide emergency housing for individuals or families who are displaced because of a fire, a pipe burst. And sometimes it's mostly families, and they may not be able to return to their units, or they're having to enter into the state's EA shelter system, which now has a priority list and a wait list. So one of the things that we have had to do is have those difficult conversations and troubleshoot. What are some other options? Are there family members, are there friends that you can reach out to? So really thinking of the holistic approach, as opposed to before it was, okay, we have a family, they can no longer return to the unit. We know that the next process is going to the state to apply to EA, but that's no longer the case, and that's regardless of whether you are a City of Boston resident or you are a migrant. So making sure that we insert that commentary so that people understand that we aren't doing anything special because this person traveled the border and are in dire straits. We understand both issues. They're equally dire, they're equally important, but also thinking of it from I mentioned cultural competency. These are individuals or families who have no resources whatsoever. You have access to mass health, you have access to food stamps. These families do not. And not necessarily having those conversations all of the time, but I think in instances where we have heard that rhetoric, it's important to replay that message of you have more than you think. You have more privilege than you think you do because you have all of these resources versus these families are starting from square zero. So it's a balancing act. We don't get it as often, but every once in a while that we do get it, we try to enforce that method of Boston is welcoming. We are all migrants to some degree, if you think about it, and really focusing on, well, what are your needs and how can we focus on those needs as opposed to getting into xenophobic rhetoric.
And I would just add that the state emergency assistance rules don't say we house migrants ahead of U.S. citizens or we house U.S. citizens ahead of migrants. It's literally first come, first served. So whoever walks into the EA offices that day, there's a priority system for health issues and stuff like that, but the wait list, everything is basically who's walking in, and there's no limit on where anybody can walk in. So I don't think that I think it's a myth, really, that somehow we're giving more resources to immigrants than we are to veterans. We're giving different resources, clearly, because a veteran doesn't need English as a second language classes. And a migrant family from Brazil might not need help with drug addiction issues. So there are different problems, different resources needed, and different resources are provided to each person's need. But getting in the door of a shelter is not at all, you don't get a leg up because you're an immigrant or a leg down because you're a U.S. citizen.
All right, well, on that notion of equal protection of the laws, let's stop and thank our panelists for excellent presentation. And feel free to engage with us and then on follow-up. Thank you all. I learned a lot. I really appreciate it.